Ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you so much for coming to this webinar on RJ in the North as a part of our A Regional Lens of Restorative Justice webinar series. My name is Demointe Wesley. I am one of the assistant directors at the National Center on Restorative Justice, and I am filling in today for my colleague, Avery Arrington, who's over our training division. And I'm so delighted to be introducing you to our fabulous panelists for today. Before we begin, I want to send a special thanks to our federal funding partners at the Bureau of Justice Assistance, part of the United States Office of Justice Programs, to our host institution, Vermont Law and Graduate School, and to our additional grant partners at the University of San Diego and the University of Vermont. We have the pleasure and privilege to do this work in collaboration in our commitment to improving policy and practice in the criminal legal system through restorative justice research, public education, and higher education. So as the title would suggest, today's conversation will center on the northeastern parts of the United States, highlighting various RJ practitioners, researchers, community-based organizations, and system actors, and their different implementation models. Please feel free to visit our website, ncorj.org, to find out about when the other regional webinars are happening, and I'll also give you those dates at the end of the webinar. And also to learn about other topics that we have this year. If you have questions as they come up, please feel free to use the Q&A feature. And if there is time at the end, we will get to those questions. So without further ado, I want to turn things over to our moderator today, Kara Cookson, who is currently serving as the Director of Victim Services for the Maine Office of the Attorney General, and is also an adjunct professor in the Center for Justice Reform at Vermont Law and Graduate School. Through her work, Kara provides training, technical assistance, and policy analysis on victim rights issues, and helps sustain a statewide network of prosecution-based victim witness advocates. Thank you so much, Kara, for taking the time to moderate all of the work that you've put in. I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much for having me. So I'm Kara Cookson. I use she, her pronouns, and I have spent the largest part of my career in the crime victim services field, working both in Vermont and Maine, primarily with prosecution-based victim advocates who support crime victims involved in the criminal legal system. So if we conceptualize harm as cyclical, I focus primarily on how systems, communities, and individuals can intervene and provide support when harm initially occurs. I believe that when we offer meaningful opportunities for accountability and repair, and we empower crime survivors to access the support and resources they need to find a new normal in their lives, we have the opportunity to break the cycle of harm and prevent a host of negative health outcomes like substance use disorder and PTSD, and even physical ailments like chronic disease. I'm a trained mediator and a victim impact dialogue facilitator. And over the years, I've worked with restorative justice programs in Maine and Vermont to develop protocols that ensure victim survivors receive meaningful invitations to participate in restorative justice opportunities that are tied to the criminal system, and that RJ processes adequately address victim needs in a trauma-informed manner that prioritizes safety and prevents new harm. And so for those joining today who are new to restorative justice, it's important to acknowledge that many of the practices that we call restorative justice today are rooted in Indigenous practices that have existed for thousands of years. This work is not new. Restorative justice is an approach to addressing harm and resolving conflict that is focused on repair, relationships, and the long-term well-being of the wider community. And so today, as we talk about contemporary restorative justice programs here in the North, we're talking about some great programs that have broken new ground in the field on so many levels. But the true history of this work goes back so much further. To start today, I think it's I'm really privileged actually to get to acknowledge that contemporary restorative justice runs deep in the North. And I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, share more about their work, how they came to the work, the origin stories of the organizations they serve. So how did your organization come to be? And we'll start with Erin Freeborn, who's with Communities for Restorative Justice in Massachusetts. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the Center for holding these opportunities for us as practitioners to be in space together and for us to share a little bit about the work that we care so much about. And so thank you for hosting us, and thank you to everybody who's taking time to be a part of it and to participate on the panel and to come in and learn and be in community. So my name is Erin Freeborn. I'm the Executive Director at Communities for Restorative Justice. We are an organization based in Massachusetts, specifically, and we can go to the next slide to orient people about our origin story and what we've grown into. So C4RJ is an independent nonprofit that partners with the legal system to respond to cases that rise to the threshold of a criminal offense. And we started in one particular community in Massachusetts outside of Boston, one of the suburbs, Concord, Massachusetts. It was about 25 years ago now, where a handful of community volunteers, and it's one of the yellow ones if you're looking at the map there, one of the communities had a few individuals who started to learn about restorative justice in the late 90s, and we're starting to read more and more of Howard Zer's work and starting to realize that people were utilizing restorative justice for diversion and as an alternative to sending cases to court. And so a few community members decided that they wanted to learn more about this.
You have water?
They weren't sure how many other people would care. They decided to have some community dialogues and invite people to join in the conversation to learn more about the principles and practices and deep roots of restorative practices. And they weren't sure how many people would show up. I think they knew that the handful of people hosting the event were going to be there, but they didn't know if they'd be the only 2 or 3 in the room. And great news is that hundreds of people showed up that night because they cared about this. They were inquisitive and they wanted to learn about how to bring it to their community. So that was how we started in one particular community 25 years ago. And over time, we organically grew neighboring community to neighboring community because people would learn about the process that we were using and they would ask the question, why aren't we doing this in my community? And specifically, the model that we use, if we want to go to the next slide, is that of restorative circles. So we use restorative circles in response to criminal incidents. And we began as a community police partnership, really working with those cases before they even touched the legal system. Our model could be boiled down to these 4 pillars. Just, if you take out all the nuance and detail and complexity, it can boil down to these 4 steps. And that's first the referral in from the legal system. And these days it's grown so much beyond police partners. It's grown to the points that we have 28 communities that are police partners who can directly refer cases to restorative justice instead of proceeding to the court. But we also partner with prosecutors' offices across the state, as you saw on that map, and also we receive calls all the time from particular defense attorneys or victims who are wondering if their case might be suitable for a restorative process instead of or in complement to the legal and courtroom process. And so we bring the parties in. Our starting document is a police report. And then we go into an intake phase where we're really saying, yes, that is the starting point to guide us about those first conversations. Who is that responsible party? Who are those named impacted parties? And then what is the rest of the story? and having conversations with each of those groups of people, trying to understand who else needs to be in the conversation to support them and to help guide them. And then once we feel like we understand the universe of impacted parties who should be in our first circle, then we move into our opening circle. And at that opening circle, you'll see there's a list of participants who are present. So even a small circle is about 8 or 10 people. And our model is the direct service in our model is provided by community volunteers. So on that map on this previous slide, you saw different colors covering different communities. We have over 150 volunteers across the state who have been trained in our model and our practice. And those are the individuals who are the ones coordinating the cases and then facilitating the cases and guiding those circles. And that's connected to one of our core beliefs that this should be community owned. Communities should be empowered to resolve harms that happen in their communities. And so that's part of our structure that we have. You'll see in the opening circle that we include facilitators and circle keepers. I think that's a terminology point that I would love to point out, that many restorative justice programs out there refer to the person that we call a circle keeper. Many other organizations call them facilitators. So just one point, that facilitators in our process are 2 trained volunteers who guide the responsible party through our restorative agreements. So I recently started talking about our model as the Oreo cookie of restorative justice or restorative practices, because we have a 2-circle model. And we have that opening circle where we're talking about the what happened, what needs were created, and the what are we going to do about it. And that's our restorative agreement. That is a written document, a contract that everybody agrees to do throughout the process. It does include meetings with those facilitators, as I mentioned, to help support and guide the person through reflective exercises, decision-making exercises, some form of expression of apology, anything else that might be a creative element in the agreement. And then when that work is done, that other part of the Oreo cookie comes together in our closing circle. And that sandwich cookie is our process that really is the full package of working a person from the beginning where the crime took place all the way through trying to better understand the impact of their actions and increase the opportunity for dialogue between the parties and engagement. And so that's a little bit about our model. The next slide kind of demonstrates how C4RJ interfaces with the legal system. C4RJ, as I said, began as a community program that really worked primarily with police departments for about 15 years. So those would be pre-complaint cases that were very much pre-arraignment. So before a person's criminal record is established with the system, which is a really important moment to work in. And over time, we have gradually built our relationships and our partnerships with the prosecutor's offices. We now partner with 3 different district attorneys' offices across the state. So Suffolk County, which covers Boston proper, Middlesex County, which is a little bit north in the northern section of eastern Massachusetts, and then the Northwestern District Attorney's Office. And we've worked really hard with them to try and work with more and more cases post-arraignment. And that can be as part of a pretrial probation. It could be part of a plea element, or it could even be as a post-disposition option. And I'm happy to go into more details about some of those scenarios later on. But to sort of circle back to a little bit more about me as a practitioner, I'll just share that I'm a person who came to this work first learning about restorative justice as conflict resolution, conflict transformation approaches to harm. And I thought about it and I really felt like this needed to be utilized more and more after crimes. And so I looked around, and C4RJ was already in existence at that time. And I just told myself that I wanted to try and make system change, but to do so from within the system. So I'm one of those people who specifically went into the field of law to do restorative work and to try and make the options in our system include restorative practices more to make them more available and to make them more accessible. And so that's kind of what I've been working on personally. I'm a social entrepreneur at heart. I'm always trying to get people to think about how to do policies and practices differently so that we're taking some of the challenging discretionary elements out of deciding who gets this chance to do this restorative work and to experience a restorative process. And it's really exciting. I've been at C4RJ now for about 10 years, and this organization is made up of many, many community volunteers and many, many system partners who are really dedicated to shifting policies to try and make restorative justice accessible on a more based on a more objective framework. And so with that, I will pass to the next to Candace.
Yes, thank you so much, Erin. Yes, and Candace King is with us from Common Justice, based in New York.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you to the center for having me and hosting this very important conversation. I also want to give a special thank you to Charlene Allen, who is also one of the reasons why I'm here today. My name is Candace King. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm the manager of storytelling and content strategy at Common Justice. We are the nation's first alternative to incarceration and victim service program that focuses on adults with violent felonies. And we're really primarily interested in advancing solutions to violence. And we're guided by these 4 pillars. We believe that these solutions should be survivor-centered, accountability-based, safety-driven, and racially equitable. And how this looks in practice is we get a referral from the court, and then if what we call harm parties, which are those who were affected by the crime, if they agree, these cases are diverted into our restorative justice process, which is a restorative circle. And this is where all parties, both harmed and those responsible, agree on particular agreements that are alternatives to incarceration. So this could look like community service, programming, leadership development, and among other things. I mean, these agreements are pretty much unique to each particular case. And once the responsible parties go through this process, their felonies are removed from their records. And it's important to note too that through our work, we also support harm parties on their healing journeys as well. And in doing so, we believe that we are breaking cycles of violence. We also like to boast that 100% of our circles have resulted in agreements. So we attribute these low failure rates to the direct service work and the restorative process that we are involved in. I'm nearly going to be a year in with Common Justice, but my entry into this work is primarily through narrative. I was formed before entering into this work. I was a journalist, and I actually reported on stories of police brutality and violence against Black and Brown communities. And I remember being incredibly frustrated in the media space because of the redundance of harmful narratives. And that's actually what even led me to grad school. And in my graduate work, I focused on surveillance of Black women, as well as their responses to state violence. And so for me, after having that graduate training, it was very important for me to find a way to apply this work within a community context. And I'm so honored that I found an opportunity like that with Common Justice.
Thank you so much. Next, we're going to hear from Jen Galvin-Weza, who's from the Center for Justice Innovation, also in New York.
Everybody, feel really great to be here with you all. My name is Jen Galvin-Weza. I use she, her, ella pronouns. I am a senior program manager at the Center for Justice Innovation, In particular, the sites and projects that I support across the boroughs is our youth-based restorative justice programming, which alternately really looks like a diversion programmatic format. And yeah, the Center for Justice Innovation, is a large nonprofit in New York City. We have relationships within all the boroughs. We also have relationships upstate in New York, as well as in Newark, New Jersey. And really the center's mission and really goals is to work within communities and justice systems to really advance equity, increase safety, and really help individuals and communities thrive. So our approach really involves this collaboration amongst really three main players: research and evaluation, our direct service programming, which is a lot of our diversion and alternative to incarceration programming, and our training and expert assistance. And restorative justice really came to fruition over the last several years, and our partnership within Manhattan for particular is where a lot of our referrals are coming from, out of criminal and Supreme Courts. And it's just giving people the possibilities. I think I speak a lot about, as a practitioner that has been doing this work for a while, is just creating opportunities for people to find healing in different ways. And although a lot of our programming is in an alternative to incarceration format, I think something I always love to speak to is the participants that actually participate in restorative justice because they want to, because there is no outcome in court. And I think that often gets lost, even when working in adjacent to the legal system and getting referrals from, arrests in particular. But just really speaking to the fact that our programming at the center and our goal in terms of restorative justice and how circle process looks like, is giving truth to power and the voice of the people most impacted, and letting them guide the process that makes things just a little better. And we always talk about the little better, which could be really healing and transformative. And we hope to see ripple and have seen ripple in our communities. And actually, personally, for me, what draws me to this work and what really brought me to the Center for Justice Innovation was being a practitioner. I was a Circle Keeper facilitator. And I was working for an early diversion program in the Bronx that uses circles as a diversion to court, where the participants then get a decline to prosecute. So a pretty great outcome, right? And then they get to co-create community with people and not necessarily have to talk about the arrest, really sit with one another, witness each other's humanity in the rawest form, which inherently is what restorative justice is about. And I think that's what drew me to be here. And as an alumna of the University of Vermont, I studied Indigenous ecological knowledge, and that's really what brought me to be eventually a practitioner in this work. It's the beauty of our work, I think, across the North is that it is rooted in the fact that, we are interconnected as people, and we're inherently interconnected. And that runs so deep and sacred. And whether it's from here to Vermont to Massachusetts, there is this thing we witness in our communities that is beautiful, and it really just shows that people really want to come together. And that's something the legal system unfortunately doesn't provide for a lot of the people in the communities we serve. So hopefully that was enough, and thank you.
That's great, Jen. Thank you so much. So next we're going to hear from Queen Cheyenne Wade and Felix Rosado, who are both here from Healing Futures in Philadelphia. And Felix also is the co-founder of Let's Circle Up.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Queen Cheyenne Wade. I use they, she pronouns. And, like you already said, Kara, I'm here with my program co-manager, Felix. And so we're really honored to be here to talk a little bit more about Healing Futures, also to talk about how we both came to this work, and, being really excited to talk about our starting of the program of Healing Futures, which is still a very new and young program. It is for Philadelphia's first ever pre-charge youth restorative justice diversion program. And so Healing Futures is made up of, trained and experienced RJ facilitators who each bring their own different passions and, centering of restorative justice into the work, which makes Healing Futures really special. We run a intensive program where, you know, we're taking cases from the district attorney's office, the diversion office, and being able to bring them through a restorative process, which can go anywhere from 2 months to 7 months. We've had young people in our program for, you know, almost a year, putting in work to eventually meet with us one-on-one, and then eventually get to a point of being able to be in circle with the person or people that they harmed and their community supporters as well. So we can all come together to talk about what happened, what impacts this has had on people in the community and people who are affected, and try to figure out a plan to make things right that the young person can do, which usually involves some sort of work in their community, really kind of also rooted in like connecting them with adults or other community spaces that they are around that will be able to really help bring them towards a future that they're passionate about, connect them with their passions, you know, connect them with things that they really need to be able to build the futures that they want to see. And by going through the entirety of our program, their charges are declined as if they were never charged, which is, you know, a really beautiful thing about our pre-charge program. We have been able to take post-charge cases and have been able to, you know, begin advocating for more of that. But one thing we are really working on as our program is progressing and growing is being able to encourage the district attorney's office to allow us to take more serious youth harms and, you know, crimes as they're discussed in the criminal justice system. And so that's something we're working on. So right now our cases right now stay at felonies and misdemeanors, but we're hoping that we'll be able to get more serious cases as we continue to work with young people who have more serious needs and who are advocating for something different. I'm going to pass it over to Felix in just a minute to also continue to talk about Healing Futures and some of the other amazing work that we do. We both have been stepping into this role of program co-managers for the past month, but you know, both have done restorative justice work in the past. And so I'm definitely really excited to pass it over to Felix to also talk about Let's Circle Up. But my own kind of guiding or the way that I got to restorative justice is I'm originally actually from Boston, Massachusetts. So that was really where I got my start in learning how to do restorative justice work. Was trained by some Indigenous elders and was also really, really invested in the domestic violence community as a survivor. And so really was around supporting survivors, thinking about alternatives to a lot of the ways that survivors can be criminalized and how restorative and transformative justice can really support survivor healing in a way that a lot of times the criminal justice system is not thinking about. And so that was really my entry point from many other entry points. And so that was something that really propelled me into thinking about what is a different way that we can bring community together to support people who have caused harm, to support people who have been harmed. And so was really, really honored to be trained by transformative justice practitioners and to continue to do this work in my own family, doing circles in my own community, and was really, really invested in doing community-centered restorative justice. And so it was a really beautiful step and big step to really learn about restorative justice diversion and the ways that they can come together. So I've been, you know, here for a little over a year and have been really enjoying doing this work as I've been doing mostly community-centered restorative justice for the past 5 years. And so I've been really, really honored to step into program co-manager with Felix. And with that, I'll pass it over to him.
Thank you so much, Queen. And I am extremely grateful to be here, to be sharing space with you all, and honored to co-manage Healing Futures alongside Queen and an amazing team that we have here. Yeah, I am program manager here at Healing Futures. I teach restorative justice at Chestnut Hill College, and I'm a death by incarceration survivor. At age 18, I was condemned to grow old and die in a cage. 27 years later, I narrowly escaped that fate via governor clemency. I've been home 2 years now, and I had the blessing of stepping right into this job here at Healing Futures upon my release. My introduction to restorative justice came while I was still inside, by way of a book, a photo essay book by Howard Zehr titled Transcending, which features survivors of murdered loved ones. And I still remember reading that book one afternoon in my cell. It was spread open across my lap. I was turning page after page, looking at face after face and reading heartbreaking story after heartbreaking story. And I realized that I had caused a family that same kind of pain. It's something I didn't really think about before then. The system in many ways prevents that kind of work. It incentivizes deceit at every turn and punishes truth-telling. But here I was faced with this hard truth. And so it changed some things for me. It helped me to see the harm I had caused from other perspectives. And at the end of the book, Howard started talking about this thing called restorative justice, which I had never heard about. It seemed pretty revolutionary to me. I was wondering why someone hadn't come up with it sooner, and I would later go on to learn that people did for generations and generations and generations. But my interest was piqued that day, and it quickly morphed into a passion. And me and some other men at Graterford State Prison came together to start a restorative justice education project to help introduce as many other people to restorative justice as possible. We later went on to name it Let's Circle Up. I did that work for 15 years until my release. And now am able to continue RJ education through teaching at Chestnut Hill, but also to work in the actual practice of RJ here at Healing Futures, where we get the opportunity to work with young people and families, to bring people together, to get community involved in the justice process, no longer having to be relegated to the sidelines, to have justice be this thing that happens to them, but rather a process that they can engage in and have a say in. So it's extremely rewarding at the end of every circle that we have with responsible youth and people harmed and community members, to hear people say at the end that they feel relieved and they feel as if a huge weight has been lifted off them and that they can now move forward, and all these things that they would never be able to say had the case gone the traditional route. In fact, they'd be feeling the complete opposite, most likely. So yeah, it brings me and our team great joy to be able to do this work. It's especially personal for me because I get to come to work and talk to my younger self about what I might have needed to hear, back when I was going through a lot of the same things that the young people here in the city of Philadelphia are going through today. So yeah, Queen covered the process well. I don't have any thing to add to that, other than we also engage with different community partners around the city. And so they might host our circles in their spaces or be community members in our conferences. And we get the opportunity to also connect with a lot of amazing community organizations out here who are doing all kind of good work, unsung work that never gets picked up by the news cycle. And so, yeah, I feel really privileged to be able to be in connection and community with so many people out here who are really trying to do something different and who are trying to make some real change, unlike the change that we might hear about through legislation and other things. So yeah, once again, just really excited to be here and participate in this conversation and learning from you all.
Thank you so much, Queen and Felix. And our last panelist is old friend from Vermont, Rachel Jolly, from the Burlington Community Justice Center.
Thank you so much. I really want to echo my colleagues, fellow panelists. Warm thanks to all of you, the National Center's hosting of this panel, as well as my fellow panelists who I feel honored to be speaking with alongside, and those of you who are tuning in today to learn more about RJ in the North. I'll start by sharing a bit of the origin story of kind of institutionalized or state-funded RJ in Vermont, because it is an interesting story of evolving that I think hopefully at some point will bring us closer to some of where my panelists' community origin stories are. We started, well, court diversion, diversion programs, as many of our panelists have talked about too, started actually in Vermont in the late 70s. When the Attorney General's office wanted to provide opportunities for youth at the time to divert from the courts. In just a few years later, it had caught on enough that by 1982, they wanted to offer those opportunities to adults. It didn't really incorporate restorative elements at the time. It was more of kind of a parole board kind of model where a group of volunteers, perhaps, and as well as paid staff, were deciding what was going to be happening to these youth, and not with. And then not simultaneously, but years later, in the 90s, in the mid 90s, the Vermont Department of Corrections instituted a survey of Vermonters, essentially around a satisfaction survey of what were Vermonters' feelings about how the Department of Corrections was bringing justice to the communities. Two main themes that came out of those surveys were, one, that folks felt like the victims were left out of the equation. No surprise, in the mainstream criminal legal system, victims' voices often are not included, or if they are, they're not necessarily centered whatsoever. And then the second theme that arose out of the surveys was that the public, the general communities, did not have any interface with what was going on behind closed doors, essentially. It felt like people went into this system, and then months or even years later, some verdict was announced, but the community had very little input or oversight, like not oversight, but there was no transparency about what was happening. And so out of those themes, the legislature decided to create a community and restorative justice unit in the Department of Corrections. That Vermont Department of Corrections funded what at its height was 19 community justice centers across the state, which is now 17 DOC funded programs, but also that the AGO programs that I mentioned before, the diversion programs, have since the 70s have funded one agency in every county. Some of those are combined, such as my center. So I realized I'd never introduced myself by name. I'm at the Burlington Community Justice Center, Rachel Jolly, she, her pronouns. And I'm located in the Northwest, where you see on this map, where there's several centers in our county, the largest county in Vermont. So some of our centers overlap in terms of funding, but what is, I think, unique in Vermont is that we have three primary funders, including the Department for Children and Families, the Attorney General's Office, and the Department of Corrections, that collaboratively fund 22 centers across the state of Vermont that use restorative justice principles. So I had mentioned in the beginning that those diversion programs funded by AGO did not use restorative principles. In about 2016, that changed, I think maybe influenced somewhat by the public's wanting them, their demand of having a little more involvement in diversion. So now, similar to some of my colleagues who have talked about that continuum of offerings, most of these RJ centers, or at least in every county, it may look different in each county because you might have one center, you might have a combination of centers, but at every stage of the continuum, from pre-charge direct referrals from the police all the way to court-ordered or probation-referred cases, are able to be referred to our centers and use restorative justice practices to find a non-punitive way of resolving and looking at repair. So I'm going to try not to repeat some of what my colleagues talked about in terms of the various ways this looks. I think there's a lot in common with that, but I think our origin story is a little different, and that comes with pros and cons in terms of these state-funded programming models. I think some centers are municipality-based, like ours. In the beginning, when I was talking about those DOC-funded programs, the city of Burlington's mayor and then Department of Corrections commissioner in the late 90s talked about a vision of a community justice center based in every town in Vermont. based out of their municipalities, as in the community should be funding and hosting this kind of community-based work. That vision never came to fruition in terms of every town, but again, at its height, there was 19 CJCs, most of which now, of the 17 that are DOC funded, have moved towards a nonprofit model. There's 6 of us left that are still based in our municipalities. The 4 in my county are all based out of municipalities. Some report to their chiefs of police. We're based in our community and economic development office, which I think frames a lot of some of the values and/or the kinds of community involvement that you might get from volunteers or other ways of being engaged with a CJC. I think there's something powerful about a municipality hosting and funding its CJC, but at the same time, I'll say that even though we are based in our municipality, only 9% of our funding does come from the city of Burlington. The rest is from either state contracts or federal grants, et cetera. A bit about my origin story or my story of how I got into this work. My background's actually in alternative education and environmental education. My experience with alternative education models is that often restorative principles and values are being used as a way of building community in the first place. Proactive restorative practices of community-based, relationship-based ways to find one's own guidelines and voice and power. And that I was interested in experiential education and opportunities that offered transformative experiences. It led me to a nonprofit that worked in workforce development, but we had programming within the women's prisons in Vermont. And I helped start a program for women transitioning out of prison into the workforce. I feel like those experiences combined led me, 1, to believe in the need for dramatic criminal justice reform, and 2, believe I really resonate and identify with the principles and values that restorative justice uses in terms of the voluntary nature of it, the primary the value on equity and voice and relationships, and the power of the trust building that comes with quality relationships, so that people do care once a relationship has been impacted in a negative way. They care about the repair and the healing involved. So that's what brought me to the CJC 7 years ago, and I still feel incredibly lucky and honored to be part of this work.
Thank you. And Rachel, your comments about how your program is funded and how that ties to your origin story is a really great segue into my next question, which is around funding, because we know that for long-term sustainability, funding is essential. And, especially where programs are closely tied to the criminal system, there can be a lot of pressure to turn cases in ways that compromise the integrity of the work or compromise the broader mission and vision within the community. And so my question to the panelists is, what mix of funding sources does your organization currently rely on, and how has your organization's funding changed over time? And maybe you can even speak to your hopes for the future too. And I don't know who wants to jump in first. I'm looking at Aaron.
Uh-oh, I'm on the spot. Well, I'll just say that I think it's really important to have diversified revenue streams. I think that's so important. You can't just rely on donors. You cannot just rely on those federal or state grants or municipalities, because the budgets change, priorities change. So I think that would be one point that I'd love to emphasize, is that anybody doing this work needs to think about different revenue streams and how you can cultivate those. So at C4RJ, we definitely, as an independent nonprofit, we write those grants. We cultivate relationships with individual donors in our communities. And one thing that might be slightly unique about our revenue streams is that we also have police membership dues. So the 28 police departments that are members of C4RJ do contribute annual dues to C4RJ. And so that is a really important element to our budget, because it's reliable, it's sustainable, And we can predict year after year that that is going to be present. And so over time, there have been a couple of things that have changed in our revenue streams. For about 7 years, we were the fiscal sponsor to a smaller startup restorative justice organization. And that was really nice. It was nice to cultivate that relationship for a program that was doing work at the back end of the legal system, as we were focused at the front end of the legal system. So that was an arrangement we had for a period of time. And then another arrangement that we had at one point in time was with an organization that ended up becoming a for-profit of its own. And but for a while started under our umbrella, and they were focused on schoolwork. So I mentioned earlier that C4RJ does narrowly focus our work on crimes, but we would often get calls from even our police chiefs who were partners, and they would say, you know, Erin, we have this incident that happened in our schools. Could you do a restorative process? And it gave us an opportunity to refer those cases over to our partner. And so those are a few different ways that we've tried to fill that balance sheet. But I do have to say that I think in this field, it's a challenge. And I think that there are a lot of people who want this work, whether those are system stakeholders, state agencies, or even individuals. But I think a lot of people have been scratching their head about how best to fund and sustainably support this work. And I know that we've experienced that in Massachusetts as well. And I think maybe Vermont has it figured out. Maybe they have a lot of guidance that we should all be listening to. But I'd be curious to hear what some of the other organizations have gone through.
Who wants to jump in? Thank you, Erin. I'm looking at maybe Felix and Cheyenne and Queen Cheyenne.
Sure. You know, as is probably true for most of our orgs, we here at Healing Futures are underfunded, understaffed. We're a scrappy team trying to make the most out of the least. And we often find ourselves having to hit the brakes on getting new referrals because we're at our capacity, you know, and that breaks our hearts to have to do that, you know, but our funding, you know, mostly comes from grants and donations. We don't receive any federal money currently. A very small amount comes from some state adjacent funding. And I mean, we're actually, you know, we choose in some ways, or in some situations, you know, not to pursue certain streams of funding because of some strings that might be attached to that. You know, so things have to be in line with our values, and you know, there are certain things that, you know, that we won't compromise on. But I mean, this is, you know, I guess this is the question, right? Like, this is the challenge we're all faced with. The system that we're up against is well funded. I mean, you know, they're in the billions of dollars. And, you know, this is what you know, this is the beast that we're fighting with our little scraps, you know. But, you know, we try to utilize people power, you know, to educate communities and try to get more people on board with restorative justice, and, you know, just different ways of approaching harm in general outside of cops' cages and courtrooms. But you know, it's interesting because like 2 years ago, there was a lot of funding to organizations who were talking about decarcerating and defunding and even abolition. So, you know, the Youth Art and Self-Empowerment Project which Healing Futures is under, was getting a lot of that money and was able to scale up, jumping from like 4 paid staff to 12 almost overnight. And a lot of that has since dried up. You know, fortunately though, restorative justice seems to be, you know, for better or worse, kind of trendy right now. And I think more foundations and donors and other people are like looking to put money into RJ. So our program Healing Futures is bringing in a lot of the funding for the overall organization. But you know, that could change overnight too, right? It's all extremely volatile, and you know, just political winds shift around, and you know, unfortunately, that's what we're dependent on. And we have a DA who falls under the category of progressive DA, and you know, says he wants 1,000 cases a year to go through RJ. But you know, what he doesn't understand is that RJ moves at a different kind of speed. You know, we have to prep people. We have to make sure everyone's ready. We have to address needs, and the well of needs is deep in each of these cases. You know, so we are not of the assembly line approach, you know, that the system is working with. So you know, things take time, and you know, people, though, you know, I appreciate like wanting that much, RJ, but if the resources aren't behind it, if the priorities aren't aligned, if you know the government, if the government priorities aren't aligned, it's going to be really difficult. So that's the challenge, you know, getting people to see the value in this and to shift funding. We're not like talking about creating new funding out of nowhere. There's plenty of money. It's getting spent on all kind of things, you know, including police and prisons and, you know, military, and I can go on, right? A fraction of any of these budgets can go to fully funding all of our programs and many more. But you know, that's the situation that we're in. So we're going to keep on, you know, trying to figure out, you know, how to get more creative with this, and you know, just try to get people to see the value in this over, you know, some other things that are extremely well funded.
Thank you. Great thoughts there. I wonder, Jen, Candace, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I can jump in. I would say most of our funding sources also comes from grants, foundations, also individuals. And sort of like similar to, you know, what Felix was saying, we also like to be also strategic in our partnerships, because mainly we want to be sure that we're mission first. And so we want to like prioritize like funding from like individuals that actually support our work, and also are like ethical as well. And we think about like our participants first, like that's our main priority. And thankfully, we are fortunate enough to have people that do root for us, that do support us. And in fact, it was really nice to see this at our spring social, which we infamously called our anti-gala. But that was just one of the creative ways that we wanted to, you know, hinge on our support, our supporters, also just let them know like this is what we're up to. This is like some of the accomplishments that we've had over the years. And we were actually able to raise like a decent amount from that. And it was just also a space that felt very like warm and inviting, and not just this kind of like formal, you know, stuff, corporate stuffiness. So I would say that being able to be creative and engaging our supporters, and also to like hinging on people who already support what we do, I think has been like super crucial for us.
I think I'll just amplify how like helpful it is to diversify your streams of funding, especially when you're thinking even like locally. And I think like something we don't often hold a lot of space for, which is it's understandable under the structures we live in, like the little money. No one ever like talks about the little money. And those like smaller grants that oftentimes provide like food for our young people for like the whole project and the duration of their time. And also for the Center for Justice Innovation over the past 3 years, 4 years, shifted very drastically, where many people still probably recognize us as the Center for Court Innovation. And we had a parent agency called the Fund, that is the Fund for New York City, and very much was our parent org. And when we separated from the fund, that opened up the possibilities for diversifying our funding. And something really specific that I haven't heard mentioned is opening it up for philanthropy, and how people invest and donate very large lump sums of money for philanthropy projects, philanthropy-based work. And before we weren't able to do that under that type of dynamic with the fund. So like autonomy is like crucial in order for the diversifying to happen. But also like when receiving these like donations, the Center for Justice Innovation very much like acquired a lot of information from people on project sites to really like think about how are we going to strategize around the funding we do have and how we can make investments to really create larger pools for our future. So like self-sustaining, very much like thinking about how we can do that within the nonprofit structure and in relation to like our stakeholders in the state and federal kind of realm. So I think that was the only thing I would add.
Thank you. Rachel, anything you want to chime in on?
Yeah, I really resonate with that theme of diversifying. We started in '98 with essentially municipal funding and Department of Corrections funding, which offered, again, a continuum of mostly even though it offered a continuum, there was most of the work was coming very much downstream. What we've been trying to do slowly over the 25 years is move more and more upstream to the preventative work, to the community-based work, to the transformative justice work with higher impact crimes. And so we have slowly been diversifying over the years and now have about 7 different funders, including that community-based philanthropy. Last year, for instance, a group of just private philanthropists in Burlington were looking around wanting, like every year they make some sizable donation to a different agency, and just approached us saying, what would you be using this amount of money for? And we did one of the things that was lacking through all of our contracts and what we felt like was coming up again and again as an issue was participant funding, just flexible participant funding that didn't have any strings attached because of the wide variety of needs that come up. We have a victim fund through one of our programs, but because it comes from Victims of Crime Act federal funding, it has all kinds of strings attached with all kinds of hoops. I mean, not comparatively, maybe all kinds of hoops. It still fills a gap. We're glad we have it. And we needed even more flexibility. And so having, as some of my panelists have stressed, I totally agree, having that kind of local philanthropy as well in the community base that can offer that kind of flexibility and independence and autonomy has really been key for us, as well as funding from the schools or partnerships with the schools to get, again, more preventative and like RJ in the community building preventative realm. So we continue to try to attempt to further diversify that to give more independence and flexibility because there are so many needs.
Great. I'm going to move on to another question. Unless Erin, did you want to chime in on that subject?
We can move on if you want. I just have one thought about the part of your question that had to do with pressure from the system if you're receiving funding from the system. To turn cases, I think it was. Maybe you could rephrase that part of the question.
Yeah, I was just talking about how I think there, sometimes when you're getting funding from the system, there's a little bit of a fee for service model, right? And with like results-based accountability, there can be this idea of like, to maintain our funding level, we need to maintain a certain number of cases that we're pushing through, right? And I think Felix and Queen touched on this a little bit as well, right? The DA saying we want to see 1,000 cases in a year, right?
Yeah, and I think I want to also lift up the fact that funding in partnership with the system doesn't always carry some sort of feeling of co-optation, because I think there are a lot of ways where nonprofits especially can stay independent from that, especially if you stay focused on your mission, as many people have already referenced, and really are dedicated to resisting mission drift for funds. And I think that that's one part of what we appreciate with our structure, is that because we are partnered with so many different stakeholders across the legal system, then that allows us to balance when we know each of those are feeling political pressure. And I think that's important for any organization to keep in mind that does partner with this system, to always pay attention to what the pressures might be that your stakeholders are feeling, and how that does and should and might impact you. So that was just one bit I thought we could add.
That's great. Thanks. So lately I've been having a lot of conversations about messaging RJ to the wider public. So I work with a lot of crime survivors, right? And crime survivors often come to the court system imagining that their case is going to play out like Law and Order on TV. That's what they know about the system. And pop culture can lead people to believe that if someone does something really bad to you, that person's going to go to prison for a long time. And when cases are referred to RJ instead, survivors can perceive that the harm they experience isn't being taken seriously, which, as we know, couldn't be farther from the truth. And so ideally, if the general public knows and understands RJ, we can get to a place where self-referrals and community referrals can become more common. And I think you all have talked about how you've started to accomplish that in your work, but I'd love to hear more about, how your organizations have addressed the challenge of messaging and spreading the word about RJ, and, what's working here.
I can start us off. So, generally in the North, there's this idea that, we're more progressive. And while that is generally, true, we also still have a lot more work to do as far as the dominant narratives on violence. And in particular, all you have to do is just take a look at some of the headlines of some of our mainstream newspapers, and you see certain words still being used. This sensation that if it bleeds, it leads, that's still something that's very common in the media. And so a lot of what we do at Common Justice, in addition to, the traditional channels of using social media, we also are very heavy on responding via op-eds. We've published quite a few this year. In particular, one that we did recently was on the recent Netflix show Unlocked, a Jail Experiment, which is a very just terrible documentary, and it was just, again, reifying some of these narratives. And so we did an op-ed with The Emancipator, pretty much debunking a lot of the myths that were in that show. So that's one way. Also, we really believe not just in that we want a approach that encompasses the ground up. And so one of our recent projects is a curriculum that pretty much is delving into narrative, and our organizing team has used this tool within communities to kind of talk through, what do these narratives mean, and what type of impact do they have in our particular communities. And I find this to be extremely helpful, because even though we're in this work, I also believe that the community has the answers as well. And so as much opportunities we have to collaborate with community, I think can give us, tremendous insight. So I would say that's one of the ways in which we're trying to hit different avenues for messaging.
Great. Yeah. Anyone else want to chime in on this messaging issue?
I guess I would say that one of our programs that started in 2006 through Victims of Crime Act money through the Center for Crime Victim Services was called Parallel Justice, which is for victims of crime, whether they report to police or not, or whether the person responsible for the crime is caught or not. And that is it's not just, it's co-located, I should say. We have 2 victim services specialists. One's located at the police to get any, use their database and do proactive outreach or reactive outreach, I guess, after a crime has been committed and has been reported to police. But also we have one staff member who's based at the CJC to respond more to self-referrals, and when victims of crime refer themselves to the CJC and want a variety of services. Spreading the word on that is a challenge, but we use, given that we are based in the municipality, again, we have access to an online classified that's really useful. I mean, everybody has access to it. It's called Front Porch Forum. I think there's something similar in many different states, but it's essentially a neighborhood-based classifieds or online. The idea is taking the place of one's front porch, where people used to be milling about and talking from each other's front porches to get to know each other's neighbors. And with the change of times, that's gone to more of an online version. But there's now a Front Porch Forum in every community in Vermont. It's an locally started program here in Burlington, or business rather, and the city has access to post on every Front Porch Forum. So that's one of the ways that we spread the word. We try and do all kinds of community and tabling events. Again, I think given our origins of starting mostly very much downstream, people weren't hearing of us because it was only once they were essentially convicted and being court ordered to come to us. We've been gradually moving towards more of the upstream work, the pre-charge work that where somebody might be getting a referral directly from police, but also more of a community division. A law was just changed in Vermont last year that will allow an exception to the prohibition of sending sexual and domestic violence cases to the CJCs. So we're now working on a federal grant that would help us pilot that kind of work that would very much be transformative justice. It would be by design meant to live outside of the criminal legal system, since we know that the majority of survivors, for a variety of reasons, do not go through the traditional system. So spreading the word is both proactive work and reactive work based on the programming and the capacity that we are able to have.
Who else is spreading the word?
I think something really important, and I've been like really thinking about this deeply, and like echoing so much of like what I'm hearing, right? Like content and like creating, streams of communication within communities most impacted, or communities that are really like looking for alternatives, like what are the possibilities, right? But I think when I even think beyond that, like the messaging often comes with connecting through people's lived experience. And what are the lived experience of people in community with one another that draws them to the possibility of thinking of RJ? And also really like framing it in a way that is amplifying the fact that people do RJ all the time. Like they just don't have a name for it. It's not identifiable, but it's in practice all the time. Which like, again, inherently like connecting people through lived experiences, and through those lived experiences, that's how you kind of like message spread the word about RJ. But is it like really spreading, or is it really just like kind of like watering the seeds that kind of have been there the whole time? And I think something that really works, and I saw a question in the chat around, like engaging community members, engaging volunteers, is very much like through lived experience. What does it look like to like bring people together in circle without necessarily like having to learn something? Like the outcome isn't learning because of a workshopping type of approach, but rather like the lived experiences that we're sharing with one another are lessons we're drawing all the time. And then that is how that message gets across the community, because you're like co-creating like credible messengers, right? Like these are people who have the lived experience of sitting in circle, can see and feel how powerful it is, and they're going back into their communities and sharing about this lived experience that people are going to inherently connect with. And so and especially because community referrals are challenging. A lot of our programs are based, you know, in adjacent to the legal system. We're getting referrals directly. But what I've noticed a lot in our community referrals that are coming in from all over the boroughs is just like people reading content in general online, but also like people being empowered to have agency in their own story and not necessarily maybe wanting to rely on the legal system. And I think at the Center for Justice Innovation, because RJ isn't our sole like avenue of service providing, we have such a like wide range where we're really meeting people in the community, and like that's where it starts. To even get to the point where if a referral comes in and people are like curious about it, or people have no idea what RJ is, they still have that feeling, they still have that lived experience they can draw from to bring them into the conversation. So I think I'm thinking more about like storytelling and what does it look like to share stories and be in community.
Thanks, Jen. We probably have time for one more comment before we have to turn to Q&A. But it feels like this session has flown by. So much great stuff here. Anyone else just want to chime in on this question?
Yeah, I would love to also just jump in, and I definitely want to echo. I feel like what Jen, Rachel, Candace, like I feel like you all spoke so beautifully about these things that I feel like me and Felix are always trying to put our heads on and also really think about. So just appreciating when you're in a space with people where the things that you're thinking about are already being named, and the things that you're kind of struggling with are already being thought of with people. So just also really grateful to be in this space with folks who are really thinking, you know, really deeply about how we are expanding the different kinds of ways that people are coming to restorative and transformative justice. And so I think that was like, I think, Jen, what you were really speaking to, I think is really what we have been thinking so much in Healing Futures, but also in being connected to a larger movement in Philadelphia that is thinking about how are we really setting up young people, families, elders, block captains, and everybody in between to be trained and to have this experience about how to hold a circle. And we really have that same kind of idea that it's going to be the community that is the referral agency that is doing the work. The young people who are in the circles doing that transformative work are the best people to talk to other young people about this work. The parents are going to be the best people to talk to other parents. And to really give them that space to also think about, how do you want to tell your story? How are you wanting to do this that also doesn't feel extractive in many ways that certain nonprofits or other organizations might think about just extracting stories from young people? We're really thinking about, how do you want to share your story? How do you feel safe to do that? And how can we support you? We had a young person almost a week ago who was on a panel talking about his experience here. And we all flooded that meeting to really make sure that he knew that he had support there this whole time, and that he had a space of community, even in these panel spaces, to tell his story. And that community doesn't just end with him graduating, right? And that's a way that he has continued to talk about, and has talked about even wanting to come back and continue to do this work. And so just thinking about how a lot of these things are not just an ending point with community when the young person graduates, right? Like Felix talks a lot about that as well, just about how we don't stop doing this work when a young person graduates Healing Futures. We're still building with them. We're still wanting them to get trained. We still want to, build up a space with them, which is also where we get to stay in their lives and continue to talk about these values of restorative and transformative justice as they grow more into them, right? As they learn more about themselves, they're able to connect to these things back with their friends, with their families. And so I think that has been a really beautiful way that we've actually seen the maybe more traditional referral process also blossom into something that is really community oriented, when we're relying on word of mouth of families and young people, rather than trying to kind of like rely solely on the district attorney's office to kind of give the best representation of our program. We know that that's only going to come from community, and specifically from the young people who come through our program as the Youth Art and Self-Empowerment Project. That's really our big thing, is how are we setting up young people to be the leaders of this movement and to be the leaders of their lives, rather than adults or other folks saying what young people need? How can we allow young people to be the namers of their futures and of their lives, right? And so I just really wanted to also uplift so many of the things that y'all were saying just about community control. And so, yeah, just seeing as a practitioner, you know, running an organization separately that does take community cases, there are so many similarities that I think I see within Philly of how people are coming to restorative and transformative justice that really has spanned far beyond like whether you're connected with system partners, whether you're in community, that those lines are a lot more blurred in Philly because of the intention that Philly practitioners have made to show that there are many different entry points into restorative and transformative justice. So I think it also is like about collaboration between different community partners, like Felix said, other diversion programs, other restorative and transformative justice programs, so that people also see a variety, that there isn't just one way to do this work. But yeah, just uplifting also everything everybody said. I could listen to everybody on this panel talk for like another 40 minutes. So thank y'all too.
Great. I feel like that's a really great place to end the formal part of our program. A really hopeful place to imagine what it looks like to plant seeds among youth. That's really great. There's we have a bunch of questions. I don't know if we'll be able to get to all of them today. Our first question is, what strategies have you used to engage volunteers? And I think someone started to talk about this a little bit, but I'd love to open it up to others.
We have a restorative justice based diversion program in the Bronx called Project Reset. We also have it across all the other boroughs, and they recruit community members to sit in those circles with people who've been arrested on very like low level misdemeanors. And those volunteers, what I want to get at is I'm a big fan of incentives. I think if you have the capacity and ability in your funding to provide incentives for volunteers, I think it really gets people engaged. And then if that is like a limitation, I really think a lot around community organizing. What does it look like to, again, co-create spaces with community to really like understand and better like listen, like what's going on, what is important to you, like what are the things you want to see, to really like engage people into the process, into programming or projects, or even being community members in like community building circles. I think has been like really, really helpful. And a lot of the recruitment for the volunteers for that program are oftentimes people who've like finished the diversion and were able to get completed and then get recruited. Also, if it is like a localization thing, we're in the Bronx, we were very intentional about, you know, volunteers being from the Bronx or living or working in the Bronx. So I think that's something that I think a lot about when you're engaging volunteers. It's like people's neighbors, people's, you know, like loved ones, people who know each other, maybe in crossing in the street. And that may look different in like metro areas like New York City and Philly, but I think that can exist anywhere. So I think that's what I thought when I saw that question about engaging volunteers.
That's great. Our next question, because I want to try to get to as many of these great questions as we can. What are your thoughts on risk and needs assessments as it relates to case planning and addressing the needs of clients? Do folks, have risk and needs assessments that end up trailing their participants, and what does that look like? How do you use those tools?
Oh, go ahead, Felix.
Yeah, that's a key part of our process here at Healing Futures. It's one of the first things we do after we enroll youth into our program. We sit down with them and have conversations about what their strengths are, what they might be needing, and then we do our best to try to gather and share as many resources as possible, because we understand that diverting a case only means so much if everything else in their lives continues to be the same. And at one time we had a full-time social worker here at YASP. That person had to move on about a year ago and hasn't been replaced. So we, as managers and facilitators, are left doing a lot of that work, and some of our interns have been, picking that up as well. So we're doing our best to really, figure out what's out there, and we're learning that there's a lot out there actually. People just don't know about it. And so we also understand that it's not enough to just send someone an email full of links of different places to go to. We have to have people come in or go meet them and like sit with them with the laptop and go through this with them, whether it's an application process or whatever, and then follow through afterwards to see if certain steps were completed. And so I mean it takes up a lot of our capacity, actually. I would say just as much as the prepping and the facilitation and the follow through of the circles. So yeah, I mean we see the need for that on all sides. The responsible youth, their caregivers might have some needs we can help them with. The people harmed. I mean, the system creates this binary, of victim and offender language that we totally reject here at Healing Futures, and it's hardly ever that clear cut. The people we serve are from the same communities, from the same neighborhoods, like might even live in the same house, and so we understand all those complexities, and we take our time with all of it, and the needs are usually the same on both sides. So we have a lot of people per case that we have to do needs assessments with, either through like a formal session or just informally through conversation, trying to find out what we can do. People who graduate from our program might hit us up like 6 months later about some issue, and we spring into action then as well. So I'd really love to hear what other people are doing in terms of that, but we center that here at our process.
Rachel, you were gonna jump in.
Yeah, I was gonna talk about the way I see that kind of on a 2-track method in terms of out of our 10 programs, only two, I think, that use a formal risk needs assessment as an evidence-based tool, really, that the state uses. So those are used on a back end sometimes, or like the referral comes through and we have the score shared, but we fortunately aren't, nothing is prescribed based on that tool that really alters the way we would do it, because we have our own intake process that really, I feel like, is a little bit more strengths-based. It focuses on protective factors, of course, but also of just seeing, especially with youth, where a few months can make a huge difference in terms of risk and needs, as well as with adults. I mean, there's on our more downstream programs that I would say are not restorative in nature in terms of it's not restorative justice processes. There might be restorative values, but the victim is not being included in our reentry programs. For instance, we have a program called Circles of Support and Accountability, which is about increasing the stability and reducing the risk of somebody who's being released back in the community after decades of incarceration, perhaps. But that's not going to be a restorative justice process per se. So for our restorative justice processes, we don't use the risk and needs assessments. And to me, I think that's a good thing, given the ones that we do use that the state sponsors or the states use technically. And some of our youth coordinators do conduct what's called VIAZI, which maybe many of you use or some of you have used, depending on your partners. I find that there's a lot of bias, a cultural bias and other kinds of bias built into them. And so I'm glad that for the autonomy and independence that we have in what those scores need to mean to our staff.
That's great response to that. And I think we've come to the end of our time today. I'm going to turn us back over to Demoite just to give some wrap up. But thank you to all of our panelists. This has been such an interesting conversation, and I wish we had another hour and a half to keep going. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you so much Kara for moderating. You can see a little bit there on the screen about how you can get in contact with each of our panelist organizations. A few more things, and then we'll let you get out of here. Part of this original lens of restorative justice webinar series, part of it was the creation of it was also to highlight a map that we at the National Center on Restorative Justice co-host with the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice. So I added a link there to the chat where you can see the map, and the map has different service providers and organizations offering restorative justice all across the country. I believe the organizations of everyone on the panel are on the map. If not, they will get there soon. Go see who is near you doing this great work. Next up in the regional webinar series, we have RJ in the Midwest on September 25th, same time, same place, and RJ in the West on October 30th. Again, same time, same place. So make sure to go to ncorj.org/webinars to register for those and all of the other upcoming offerings that we have. And then last, but certainly not least, please make sure to fill out the feedback form at the end of the webinar. Once you exit out, there will be a feedback form. So many of the topics that we've covered in this webinar series, our director over the training division, Avery Arrington, pulls from the feedback that is offered. So we really are trying to craft webinar series that really are servicing the needs that our audience is looking for. So please give us that feedback if you have the time and willingness. Again, thank you so much for being a part of this panel and coming here. Thank you so much for